Welcome everyone. Is this thing on? All right, yeah. All right. Every Friday we try to learn something from my holy ancestor, the Maharal Prague. This week we start the book of Leviticus, Parshas Vayikra. In Leviticus chapter 2, verse 12, it says, "V'chol korban minchoscha b'melach timlach lo yisashbis melach bris Elohecha me'al mizbechecha al kol korboncha takrif melach." And all of the sacrifices of thy meal offerings shalt thee salt with salt, and you should not allow to cease salt, the salt of the covenant of thy God, from thy meal offerings. Upon all of thy sacrifices shalt thou offer salt. Says Rashi, Melach bris. What does it mean, the salt of the covenant? Shabris krusa la melach. There was a covenant that was cut with the salt. Misheshis imei bereshis. That dates back to the 6 days of creation. Shuftechu hamayim etachtonim lekarev v'mizbeach b'melach v'nisach hamayim b'chog. That the lower waters promised to be offered on the altar, or they were promised to be offered on the altar, but melach, with the salt, v'nisach hamayim b'chag, and the water libations on the Feast of Tabernacles. Sukkos, al kol korbancha, on all of thy sacrifices. Rashi says, al olus behema v'oluf v'murei kol kadashim kulan. This includes not only the meal offerings mentioned in the scripture explicitly, but then also all of the sacrifices, the cattle, the domestic mammals, the birds, and all of the sacred sacrifices will all be offered with salt. In the Aryeh, the Maharal Prague says, "L'korev hamayim etachton v'mizbeach v'melach." They were offering the lower waters in the altar with salt, melech in Iraq mayim krushim. According to their aim, salt is a form of solidified water. Shaharim snichenu b'mayim nimus b'mayim. Because if you put the salt into water, it becomes dissolved in the water. Now that's kind of a strange approach, not really scientifically accurate in totality. However, both the table salt, the sea salt, and water are both what we would call salts. A salt in chemistry is a neutral acidity, neither acid nor base. I think it's number 7 in the pH scale, which means that salt represents that archetype of balance. It's a neutralizing effect to avoid extremes, and that's what it could represent theoretically. And so both salt and water are both neutralizing in that sense. Then we notice the Zayda Maharal notices that Rashi mentions both the salt, which is on all the sacrifices, and the water libation that was only offered on Sukkot, on the Feast of Tabernacles. So, says the Heilige Zayda Maharal, Nokat Nisuch Hamayim. This mention of the water libation, so the mention of the water libation is to avoid this question. If a promise was made to the water, so then the water itself should go on the altar, not the salt. Lo melach, right? Not the salt. So, if that's the issue, we mentioned that we have both. We have salt in all the sacrifices, and we have the water libation during Sukkot. But then you have another question. What do you need both for? Why do you need both the salt and the water libation? The sagim and Nisach Shari Yosadev. It should be sufficient just to have the water libation. And that covers it much more than the salt. You don't need the salt anymore. So says my holy ancestors of the Maharal, you could say that because when it comes to sacrifices, there are two things. Machel, basar, there's solid food, like meat, mashke, and liquid, the libation, like the wine libation. That's the wine libation. Boim, shneim, minamayim. They both come from the water. Melech, b'basar, v'lechem, shel mizbeach. The salt accompanies the bread and the meat that is on the altar. And the water libation comes with the liquids. And furthermore, the other thing is that water and salt are actually not similar. They're actually opposites. For example, water is wet and salt is dry. So one could not fulfill the archetype that's represented by the other. From Elam Tovin Oisam Oid Lamahuv Charu Elishnaim Shnayim. So from these two things we can understand in a very strong manner why these two items were chosen to be offered on the altar. In this homily, we find a very deep secret. Everything is supposed to be elevated. That's the purpose of everything in this world, is to elevate up to God. This is Gemara in Brachas, Gemara in Shabbos, a little bit more famous. I just learned Brachas. I'm learning Shabbos now. That when it comes, and I believe it's actually in Shabbos, that we go up in holy things and we don't go down. So lower waters were separated from the upper waters and were made lower waters. It's not that they were originally down, they were originally up. That's the opposite of the proper order of creation and how we find things. Everything is supposed to go up constantly. So therefore they were not separated from them until God promised them that they would be offered on the altar. That would be in order to acquire this elevation. And that was through their separation, the higher waters from the lower waters, so for which they were made lower waters. It was already explained that this attribute could be found by the Blessed Lord. What did God choose to be on the altar? Only things that are considered lowly. Sh'amru, the Gemara, the Talmud in Bava Kama, Tzadik Gimel Amud Aleph, notes 93a in Bava Kama. Lama Bocher B'Torah V'Neyona. Of all the different birds, you would think a worthy sacrifice should be an eagle, a peacock, something very majestic, something very beautiful. Why did God choose pigeons and doves? The Talmud says, it says in Ecclesiastes, right after the time for every purpose, in that same chapter 3, that God seeks out that which is pursued, the victim. That's who God cares about. And so there's no more victimized bird. There's no more sought after, pursued bird than the pigeons and the doves. Similarly, when it comes to animals, to the mammals, wise and again, very beautiful gazelle is kosher, right? But instead, it's these domestic animals which are subjugated. They are victimized. They are submissive, these animals. The cow, the sheep, the goat. And the blessed Lord chose them. No, I'm recording, Shlomi. This world, what does this represent? That this world is a materialistic world, it's a physical world. That there's more things that control it and that are successful at it. If you're successful in this world, it's because you're connected to this world. But someone who's victimized, someone who is chased, someone who is pursued, he doesn't have as much connection to materialism. He becomes much more spiritual. And so therefore that which is more spiritual is chosen to be elevated much higher in the spiritual form. And behold, that which received a lacking in the separation from the higher waters, meaning because they lowered themselves, the lower waters lowered, therefore they were chosen to be offered on the altar. So So because it was separated from the higher waters, they were worthy to be offered on the altar. So the fact that these waters are not great in this world is not something that's low for them. It's just the opposite. That's what makes them greater. Klal Davar, because the general concept is like this. Kemiyut ametzias shalolam hazeh, moral shukarav l'nivdol. Because the smaller something is in this world, that indicates the archetype that it is closer to that which it's separated from, meaning from the original source to God. And if this wasn't the case, then the waters would not have been separated from the higher waters to become lower waters. And if this wasn't the case, that these lower waters are closer to the higher waters that they were separated from, this is what's hinted, kasher tavin. This is what the sages hinted to, as we understand. Furthermore, there's also wonderful things we can learn from this. Something that's pushed down more and victimized, they're seeking to rise up higher. This is something that's hinted to in many places. The more one humbles himself and lowers himself, God lifts him up. So therefore, anything in the world that is lower, more than necessary, they're going to get to be lifted up to the highest level. And therefore, that since these waters was separated to be below, the promise that they'll be brought up onto the altar, and we don't have to say this any longer than this. One more short Maharal, Lotus Behema, that the scripture specifically mentions the meal offerings, but then it says all the offerings, and that the word all the offerings indicates the animals. The Mincha Kvar Ksiv, right? The scripture already writes the meal offering. And as the Gemara Menachos brings, the fact that it says all the offerings, that includes the offerings of the cattle and the poultry and so forth. Thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment. We hope to see you real soon. Have good Shabbos, everybody. Sorry for not editing this video. I don't have time to edit. We'll see you later.